Hello there, my name is Christopher Lovejoy. I'm a junior doctor working in London, and today I'm sharing a few thoughts about quote-unquote leaving medicine, as well as recommending some resources that I think would be useful for anybody thinking about leaving medicine. Firstly, I think it's relevant for me to just explain a little bit about myself and my current position. So I have just completed what is called the Foundation Programme in the UK, which is a 2-year programme which you do right after leaving medical school, which forms the foundation of your general training in medicine. So after the Foundation Programme, in these 2 years, you're then free to apply for speciality training, which can be in any of a host of different specialities. But my plan is to do a 1-year Masters in Data Science and Machine Learning in London. And my plan for the following year is to work in a non-clinical role applying machine learning to healthcare. So at the end of those 2 years, I'm going to reassess the situation. I might decide to fully return to clinical medicine, I might decide to fully stay in the tech side of things, or I might decide to try and find a combination of the two. And deciding to take this decision of stepping away from the more traditional routes in medicine, which is to complete one training program, then go into the next training program, and gradually become more specialized and more experienced. This was in my mind for several years, probably since towards the end of medical school, but it took me a while to figure out exactly what it is that I wanted to do. But the first thing I want to talk about is this idea of leaving medicine. So throughout my last placement, which was in A&E, as well as actually some of the previous rotations as well, a lot of people were asking, what do you plan to do after you finish F2? And as I became more and more certain that I wanted to go down this route of machine learning, I became more confident in saying, so I'm planning to take a master's in machine learning and gain more experience in the area and build up my technical skills and programming skills, etc. And the response that I would often get to that is people would say, oh, so you're leaving medicine then? But actually, I just want to address this as a concept because I think the traditional view is that you continually progress up this elevator of training. So you complete medical school, which is 5 or 6 years. You do, in the UK, it's the foundation program, so F1 and F2, and then you do specialty training. In America, you're an intern, then you do residency, then you're an attending. And traditionally, people tended to follow that path fairly linearly. But actually, there are a lot of roles within what I would consider the umbrella of medicine, which don't specifically involve a task on that elevator. And I would consider machine learning applied to medicine to be one of those. So when people say, oh, so you're leaving medicine then, I actually consider moving into machine learning in medicine to be more of moving into a different area of the medical field. So the traditional perception has been that doctors, they turn up to work, they do their clinical practice, they see their patients, and then they go home, and maybe they might maintain some communication with those patients when they're at home, but broadly, there's nothing else kind of within the job description of being a doctor. But I think that more and more that is changing. You're seeing doctors being involved in other areas. Things like communication with the public, which can be in traditional ways, writing for the media, might be more recent mediums such as a YouTube channel or a blog, sharing some insights about medicine with other doctors and with the public. And then you're also seeing doctors move into other industries such as management consultancy, working for pharmaceutical companies and scientific research, etc. But while those roles don't involve a lot of clinical work, for me, I would still consider those to be medical because you're still applying what you've learnt and understand from having studied medicine and having worked in a healthcare setting to then address different elements of the healthcare problem or the healthcare challenge. So I guess what I'm trying to say is I don't view taking a year out to do a master's degree in a relatively non-traditional subject like machine learning to be leaving medicine. And in actual fact, I think machine learning has a huge number of applications in healthcare. But for the rest of this video, I'm still going to use the expression leave medicine just for simplicity. So now I want to think a little bit about the question of, should I leave medicine? And I think the response to that should be, why are you thinking about leaving medicine? Is it that you're unhappy with certain elements of practicing medicine? Is it that there's something else that you're particularly keen to do instead of or alongside medicine? If it's the first case, if there's things that you're unhappy with, are those going to change in your other career? Because I think when you work in a particular career, you come to enjoy some of the good sides of it, but you also come to understand what some of the less enjoyable sides of it are. And I think it's easy to be in a career and be very aware of all the negative aspects of that career and look at another career and say, oh, wouldn't it be wonderful if I could do this career, when actually that career is going to have its own negatives. You just might not fully appreciate what those are. And there are some careers which I often hear people in medicine talking about being interested in. One example is management consultancy. I hear a lot of people saying, oh, I would love to just go away and just be a management consultant and make this much money every year. But the truth of it is, if you talk to someone who's doing management consultancy, and even people who've gone from medicine to management consultancy, they'll be able to tell you some of the pros that has, but also some of the drawbacks from working in management consultancy that maybe aren't clear until you've worked in it. And another popular one is tech careers. You hear a lot of people saying they want to be an entrepreneur, run a startup, etc. But actually, there's quite a lot to that. It's not just a case of coming up with an idea and making that into a company. There's a lot of stages in between that. There's a lot of hard work, there's a lot of uncertainty, etc. So I think it can be quite easy to fall into the trap of glorifying an alternative career and spending a lot of time just longing for that career, but it's not necessarily reflective of the reality of working an alternative career. And then if there are elements of your career that you are unhappy about, is that going to change at some point down the career as you progress? Maybe as you become more senior, you have to do less admin work, or maybe you really hate taking bloods, and as you become more senior, you're not going to be taking bloods as much. Or is there something that you can do to change that area of dissatisfaction? Maybe you're working on a particular ward and you don't like the way that that ward is run, and you might be able to proactively approach the relevant people and try and change how that works. Or maybe there's a way in which your hospital is run and you want to talk to the CEO and try and change that. Or it might be the case that there's different specialties which have more or less of a certain type of task that you particularly don't like. So when I was asking this question myself, I was given some advice that I found very helpful. The first piece of advice was you should leave medicine because there's something else that you want to go into, not because you want to get out of medicine. And I think for people who are dissatisfied with medicine and want to find an area to go into, I think the best approach to take is actively try and find that area. And I'll talk about that shortly. And I was told you should pick a specialty based on the bread, not based on the jam. The jam is the really exciting, interesting parts of the specialty. In cardiology, that's your stenting, your angiograms. But actually, that doesn't comprise the majority of the specialty. There's a lot of other things that you have to do in that specialty which are a little bit less sexy, and that's the bread of the sandwich. Now I just wanted to share a little bit of what my decision process was like and why I decided to shift away from clinical medicine. But firstly, I want to say that these reasons are highly personal to me and very individual. There's no right or wrong answer, but for me, these were the three main reasons why I decided to take a year or two out of clinical medicine. The first reason is that I found I really love being in a state of flow. Flow, if you're not familiar with it, it's a concept from a psychologist called Csikszentmihalyi. Essentially, it's this state where you are completely immersed in a task that is both challenging, but you're able to do, and you lose a sense of time and you just focus on that task through to completion. And I find working in medicine, it's often difficult for me to get into that state of flow and to maintain it. And the reasons for that is because working as a doctor, you are continually interrupted throughout the day. It might be that a nurse comes and asks you to review a patient, to prescribe something, to check an ECG, to check some blood test results, or it might be another doctor handing something over to you. It depends a bit on the speciality, but pretty much unanimously across the medical specialities, you are continually given work, and often it's very time sensitive, and you then have to continually readjust your priorities. And that's fine, that's just the nature of medicine. That's the way that it needs to be done because of the type of problems that you're dealing with. But for me, I found that that affected my ability to enter into this flow state. For other people, it may be different. They may find actually in those kind of settings, they're still able to enter into a flow state. But for me, I found the continual interruptions and the continual change of what the primary task I'm doing is just prevented me from really immersing myself in exactly what I'm doing. The second reason is this idea of scalability of impact. I'm very interested in trying to maximize the positive impact that I can have on the world in my short lifespan on this planet. And one thing that affects the amount of positive impact that you can have is this idea of scalability. So actions that you take, how far can they scale up to impact a lot of people and have a lot of collective benefits? And certainly medicine is a career where you are having a positive impact. You're seeing patients when they're unwell, you're diagnosing and treating disease. If you have a positive interaction with a patient and help change their life in a positive way, that can then have knock-on effects in making them more confident or more happy or understand their health, which can have knock-on consequences for them further down the line. But the potential for scalability is less in medicine than it is in some other careers. And I'll use scientific research as an example. Let's say you go into scientific research and you discover a new technique, or let's say a new treatment for a particular genetic disease. That treatment is very scalable because that treatment can then be used on every single person in the world with that genetic disease living today and any that might potentially live in the future. And essentially, if that's an effective treatment, you might be able to cure millions of people of a genetic disease. In that way, the impact of that discovery is very scalable. Whereas when you look at clinical medicine, the impact that you have is treating the patient directly in front of you. So on a typical A&E shift, I might treat 10 patients or 12 patients, and maybe if I become more experienced, I might treat more than that, but it's not very scalable. And the better I get at it doesn't necessarily mean that that impact is going to be able to scale up to larger audiences. There's some interesting research and guides that have been written on this subject for those who are interested. I'll link them in the below. There's a group called 80,000 Hours who've done some studies on the impact of working in medicine and working in other specialties. So check those out if it's something that you're interested in. The third reason why I wanted to try something different to clinical medicine is the hierarchy and the lack of meritocracy in medicine. I've had some frustrating situations where I've been on a placement and I haven't felt that the seniors are doing a particularly good job of running a ward. But ultimately, the senior is going to run it however they want to run it, and you pretty much have to put up with it because they're the consultant. And I think it's a reflection of the fact that in medicine, you're pretty much guaranteed to progress up the career ladder as long as you're above a certain competency threshold, because you spent a lot of time training, a lot of money has been invested into training you to be that doctor, and your livelihood is centered around that. So it's not the kind of career where if someone is good but not great, that you can then tell them to leave. But the downside of that is sometimes you will have a senior who actually just isn't a fantastic doctor. But unfortunately, there's no easy fix for this, and sometimes you just have to put up with it. So those are my main reasons. As I said, it's highly personal. You might agree or disagree with these reasons. And I'd be interested to hear if there's anyone else asking these kinds of questions as well, or thinking about leaving themselves, or who have stepped off that career trajectory. What are your reasons for thinking about leaving medicine or deciding to take a period of time out? Drop a comment below and I'll be very interested to read about that. The truth is that I do really enjoy medicine. I love a lot of elements of the job. I love communicating with patients. I love trying to work out what the problem is and what the solution is. I love explaining things to relatives, having good conversations with patients, and I genuinely enjoy a lot of the elements of medicine. For me, it's just the case that purely clinical medicine alone doesn't fully satisfy me, and that I want to combine medicine with other things. So now I just wanted to talk about some resources that I found useful when I was considering this question of should I leave medicine. So the first resource, I would highly recommend the 80,000 Hours Careers Guide. So 80,000 Hours is this organization based around the idea that in your career you have 80,000 hours of work on average, and that you want to find something that's satisfying and find something that has a positive impact. And they have this fantastic careers guide that you can work through both as a video series but also as a series of blog posts or as an ebook. But that was a really fantastic thing to work through, and they also have these profiles on different careers. The second thing I would highly recommend is this book by Michael McLaughlin called Do You Think You Wasted All That Training? And it's a book, I'm actually just going to go and grab the book, one sec. Where's that book at? Can't find it. Okay, I actually just couldn't find it. Anyway, it's a fantastic book. It's called Do You Feel You Wasted All That Training? It was written by someone from America who started out as a doctor and then moved into medical communications. It's a very useful breakdown of the stages that you should be thinking about when you're transitioning. So it starts, I think, by talking about introspection and asking, what's important to you? What do you want to get out of a career? Then it talks about more practical steps like how can you find out about different careers, what the ins and outs of them are, how can you connect with people, how can you gain that insight, and then practically how you shift yourself into a position where you can then make that transition. The third resource is a book written for a general audience, which is called So Good They Can't Ignore You by someone called Cal Newport. He's a computer science professor in America, and this book talks about how this idea of just follow your passion actually isn't a very reliable way to find a career that is satisfying and meaningful. And he makes the argument that in order to find a career that makes you happy and where you feel that you're having a positive contribution, it is much more about developing skills to a level where you are, as the title states, so good they can't ignore you, and it gives you this career capital that you can then use to get the kind of career that you want. And the fourth is a short blog post by someone called Derek Sivers, and it's called Don't Be a Donkey. And I'll link that below, as with all the other resources. And basically the story is about a donkey who's looking at food and he's looking at water, and he's standing in the middle deciding which one to go, but because he's an exact distance between the two, he doesn't go either way and he just stands there until he starves. So the blog post just makes the point, don't stand there looking either way, decide one, and you can always then go back and try the other one. So now I want to talk a little bit about how to actually make that switch. What does that look like? The first thing to say is that making a career transition is not a trivial thing to do, and to do it successfully takes a lot of reflection, a lot of hard work, and a lot of time, but that I think it's valuable to invest time and effort into at least exploring whether you want to make that change, because then that determines the career that you work in for the rest of your life, and that will have a significant impact on your life satisfaction and overall happiness. So one concept that I quite like is this idea of little bets. And there's a book by the title Little Bets by someone whose name I can't remember, which I'll be completely honest, I actually haven't read the book, but I understand the concept. And the concept is that in order to find out about whether you want to do a big project, it's better to start with a small project. And if, for example, you're thinking about making a career change, the best approach is to make lots of little bets and see if they then pay off. So for me, when I was thinking about moving into machine learning, some of the first little bets that I made were completing a Python programming course and completing a course in machine learning by Professor Andrew Ng. These were things that at the time were very tough to do and took up time, but it's something that I needed to do in order to gain the insight into whether this is something I wanted to do further. So rather than just trying to make the leap of, I want to now quit my job as a doctor and become a programmer or become someone who works in machine learning, I looked for concrete small steps that I could take, which would then give me that insight. This was very useful because before I decided to go down the machine learning route, I thought I might want to do management consultancy. And I actually spent 2 to 3 months practicing what's called the case interview, which is the way that they assess people for management consultancy. I worked through 2 textbooks, I met up with some friends, did some practice questions, wrote my cover letter, sent it off to McKinsey, Bain, BCG, and all these other firms because that was what I thought I wanted to do. But actually in the process of doing those case interview questions, I then realized actually I don't really want to be doing this kind of thing for the rest of my life, or even for this particular period of time. So I ended up, after having done a certain amount of practice, withdrawing those applications and focusing more of my effort into programming and understanding machine learning. Now you could make the argument that that was a big waste of time. I spent 3 months doing study of business principles, but actually I would say that that was key for me to understand that that's not something I want to do as a career in the short term. And if I'd never gone through that process of committing to finishing that and spending a lot of time working on that, I never would have fully gained that insight, and I might be thinking, well, what if I want to do management consulting? And I think this master's degree that I'm doing next year, I could even look at that as not really a little bet, but maybe more of a big bet. If I find that after doing a year's master degree in machine learning that that's really not something I enjoy, then the option is always there for me to then take a step back and move more into a clinical role or more into another area that I'm interested in. And I actually believe that if I then came back into medicine and joined a training program, I'd be in a much better position for having completed that degree because I'd understand data and machine learning and the potential applications of those much more, even if I didn't want to work full time in that kind of role. One thing I want to stress here is the fact that learning the area that you want to work in and actually shifting yourself into a position where you can move into that area takes a lot of hard work. So typically I was doing a day working as a doctor full time, and in the evenings I would spend 3-4 hours coding or 3-4 hours studying management consultancy principles or some kind of other task related to a potential career decision that I was going to make. And I think it's inevitable that some of it will feel inefficient in that you'll do tasks that end up not going anywhere. For example, I did a project in public health with my local county council, and it was an interesting project, but I invested quite a lot of time into it, and it was with the intention of trying to understand if public health was something that I was interested in. And again, ultimately I decided that that's not something I want to delve deep into. So I could look at that project as a waste of time, because that's not something that's going to be useful for my CV when I'm applying for coding jobs, but actually it was very useful because it helped me to see whether that's something that I wanted to do or not. Another thing I just want to briefly address is the fear of leaving medicine, or the fear of stepping off this conveyor belt. And I think it's very reasonable to have this fear about taking time away from the standard training program in medicine. There's a lot of unknowns when you step into another area. I personally found I got comments from friends and family saying, oh, are you sure you want to do this? Like, we think it'd be better for you just to stay in medicine and just complete that training and become a consultant. And maybe once you're a consultant, then have a think about doing other things. But actually, you should just finish your training up until then. What I found quite helpful to think about this, firstly, is that it's your life, and that finding a career that you find fulfilling and satisfies you should be one of the top priorities to do. And the second thing is, you don't have to fully commit to leaving medicine. As long as you've completed the relevant level of training, there's often a lot of potential to take time out and then come back into medicine if needed. And this is something that is becoming more and more acceptable. So ultimately it can be very scary and very daunting, but it's something that I think could also be very worthwhile. The final question I've also been asked is, when is the best time? And in my opinion, there is no perfect time. Again, it's very much individual. There's multiple stages that you can take time out. I don't want to delve into the ins and outs of taking time out at different stages in this video. And again, it's very much a personal thing depending on where you are in your current career. So that's everything that I wanted to say. I apologize if that's somewhat of a rambly video. I've tried to answer all the questions that I've been commonly asked in the past. I hope that was somewhat useful or interesting. I think in summary, if you're not 100% satisfied with a career in medicine, it's worth at least thinking about what the alternatives are and assessing whether you would consider working at any of those. Maybe taking little bets towards seeing whether those are for you. If you decide that then it's not and you continue staying in clinical medicine, I think you'll be better off for it, because you can be more content and satisfied that that's exactly what you want to do. And if you do end up doing something else, then I think that's great, because you found another area that can be related to medicine or not related to medicine, which you enjoy enough to have changed your career, which hopefully will then lead you to have a happier and more satisfied life. But regardless, going through a period of transition is going to involve a lot of hard work, and it's going to take time. That's everything for today. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you in the next one.